Morning, everyone. So, what I thought I'd do on this first morning of official lockdown, although I don't think it is officially lockdown, was just talk you through some of the first sections. So, last week I sent you out a message, all of you, all three groups, just to say, what you should be working through, where you should be aiming to get through in terms of the last booklet, which is this one. What I thought could be quite nice this morning would be to just talk you through the notes and just add a little bit of extra elaboration to it. If that's something that you would appreciate, keep tuning in. If it's something that you are totally disinterested in, feel free to turn off and go and do something else with your morning. So what we are starting with really is behaviour. So the first thing to think about is, what is behaviour? It's essentially a response to a stimulus, in the same way that, previously throughout your education in biology you will have learnt about responses to stimuli. So we've talked about reflex arcs and coordinators and effectors and so on and so forth. And behaviour just fits into that category in just the same way. Sometimes people feel like behaviour, because it's in many ways seems to be seen as like psychological, that it's not quite the same, but it really is. It depends upon neuronal, so nerve pathways, and chemical responses. So you've got all of the sort of endocrine system involved with it as well. So the key thing to remember is that, like other examples you've talked about in the past, behaviour is something that inherently, if it is adaptive, which means it's good for an organism, as opposed to maladaptive, which is bad, it should increase the likelihood of the individual survival, but also the species survival. So we're not always just talking about one individual organism. We are also talking about an entire species. So it's very, very important. And these behaviours have come, a lot of them, especially the first ones we're talking about, which are the innate, the inbuilt behaviours, have come about through evolution. So you've had individuals that have exhibited certain behaviours because they have certain pathways established neuronally, chemical ones, that have made them better at surviving than others. Whereas you may have others in the population that didn't have that behaviour, didn't exhibit it, didn't survive to reproductive age, didn't pass on those specific instructions, those genes, those alleles, etc. So we'll start off with innate behaviour. So anything that is innate is something that is hardwired. So it's built in to the organism. It's brought in through DNA. So it is something that is very much part of you. And it's really important because these are the responses, these behaviours that you don't need to learn. So these are ones that aren't dependent on your ability to learn, and they're not dependent on the experiences that you've had. It's not like if you miss out on listening to something or seeing something, you won't exhibit this behaviour. It is with you from the get-go. So usually what we have is we have a specific response to a stimulus. So a stimulus comes in, you detect it through some sort of receptor, your sensory system, and every single member of a particular species will respond in the exact same way. If they don't, potentially they'll die, so they'll be wiped out of the gene pool. Great, lovely. So what happens is the response is usually as a result of a very, very specific neuronal, so nerve or chemical pathway, and you end up with the same end result each time. And what we tend to call it, and it's referenced in your booklet, is an innate releaser mechanism. So every single member of the species, every single time they come across that stimulus, this is their automatic response to it. Okay? Now, these responses, if you think back evolutionarily, have been refined and they've been bettered each time, because obviously you'll get some individuals that were maybe slightly better with that behaviour, add a slight tweak to it that made them better at surviving. If they're better at surviving, they're better at reproducing, hopefully, and they pass it on. Okay? The other school of thought around this is that when you've got organisms like ourselves with higher developed brains and more capacity for learning and adapting to our surroundings, having these sort of inbuilt, hardwired autopilot responses frees our minds up to learn new things and learn new responses and get better at surviving, because you have to remember that survival and adaptations aren't purely physical ones. It's not about whether you've got wings or amazing claws or you make a certain enzyme. Sometimes it's about your response behaviourally. So humans are famous for that. You know, we have great behavioural responses. The idea of our intelligence that makes us really good at processing the information around us, at reading each other, at changing our behaviours to suit where we are, and that is really important, and that's why things like inbuilt responses, innate responses are so important. Anyway, I digress. If we move on, there are 4 main categories of innate behaviours that we're going to address. 3 of them are really very simple behaviours and the ones that you should already be familiar with, and then the last one, which is instinctive behaviour, is far more complex, and we will briefly touch on it now, and then we will move on to it in more detail later on. If you flick through the booklet, you'll see that things like territorial behaviour, courtship, mating, reproduction, they're all in there, and that comes under the instinctive behaviour bit, which, as I say, there's a bit more to it. So hopefully a lot of you are familiar with kinesis, taxis, and simple reflexes. So this shouldn't be anything that is too new or unfamiliar or complicated. So kinesis responses, they are all about either allowing an organism to stay within an environment or an area which is beneficial to them, or remove themselves out of one that is less beneficial into one that is better. It is not about moving directly towards or away from a particular stimulus, okay? That's taxis. So kinesis is usually to do with either the speed of movement, so how fast something is moving, an organism, or the rate of turning, so how like random its movements are, or both of them. Okay, so some organisms exhibit both in response. You'll probably be familiar with woodlice are quite good at that. You can do their rate of turning. So the one that's to do with speed is actually called orthokinesis. So that's where, depending on the intensity of the stimulus, so like how hot or how cold or how light or how dark or how humid, moist, and how dry something is, the rate of movement of the organism will change pretty much proportionally. Okay, so what will happen is things will either speed up or they'll slow down. In general, if you are in an unfavourable environment, you're going to speed up because you need to get out. If you are in a favourable environment, you're going to slow down because you want to stay in. Hopefully that makes sense. The other one is the kinesis, and that's to do with the rate of turning. So some organisms will turn more frequently, and that actually can keep them in the same place. Like if you imagine standing somewhere that's great, and if you are constantly turning, you will pretty much stay on the spot. Does that make sense? Whereas if you are not turning very often, you're more likely to follow a straight line or a straight trajectory, which is probably more likely to get you out of there. And some organisms will combine kinesis, so the rate of turning, with orthokinesis, which is the speed of it. So they might, for example, slow down and turn more often, and that will keep them almost stationary. Or they might speed up and turn less often, which means they're more likely to follow a fast straight trajectory and get out of there. So one way that I like to remember the difference between taxis and kinesis is about like how fast, how slow you're moving or how often you are turning, whereas kinesis is about whether you're moving towards something or away from it. So did I just say kinesis? I meant taxis. Apologies. I can't remember what I said now. It's quite early in the morning. Taxis, like a taxi, taxis take you to places or away from places. So that's always how I used to remember it. Those of you that did A-level probably did the choice chamber experiment, which is the picture that you can see on the diagram that you can see on page 3 of your notes, which is essentially where you take a very simple organism, could be woodlice, maybe maggots if you were really lucky, and you give them usually 4 choices. So you usually have 2 chambers that are light, 1 moist, 1 dry, 2 chambers that are dark, 1 moist, 1 dry, and then you look to see whether they congregate in one area more than another. So do they favour a particular area more than another one? Or sometimes you can measure things like their rate of turning. So you might have a line and you might count how many times they cross that line, so on and so forth. But choice chambers are a really nice way to have a little look at kinesis and just see how an organism responds to it. So as I say, taxis then, that is where you move towards hopefully a favourable stimulus or away from an unfavourable stimulus. And there are many different stimuli that you can have a taxis response to. So you can have chemical ones, that's like a chemotaxis, or the ones you're probably most familiar with are things like photo, moving towards and away from lights. Insects, really good at that. Normally not great for them. That's one pretty good way to kill them, is if you get one of those zappy traps. But if it's moving towards something, it's a positive taxis response, and if it's moving away from something, it will be a negative taxis response. So on page 4, it gives you a whole load of different types of stimuli and the prefix, so the part of the word that you put before taxis and what that means. And that's quite interesting. I mean, if you're into language and you're into a bit of sort of Greek and Latin, it's quite nice to look at those. So that's taxis and that's kinesis. And then the last one are simple reflexes, which, as we know, are automatic. You don't have to think about them. They just happen. They are rapid, okay? Because, again, they are very, very simple neuronal pathways that don't involve any higher processing from your central nervous system. You're not thinking about them. They happen very quickly. Usually you've only got 2 synapses to sort of muddle your way through, in essence. And they are pretty much always the same to each stimuli, and we're born with them. They are inbuilt. Sometimes you lose them, so if you're interested, have a look at the newborn reflexes, because those are fascinating ones. Things like the Babinski reflex, the startle reflex, the rooting reflex, suckling, etc. And those are all designed to help babies from the get-go to survive, because one thing that we do know is that human babies are pretty useless on the survival front. So there needs to be something that gets them to feed and hold on to things and so on and so forth. So hopefully the diagram makes sense. It should make sense. You've got a motor neuron causing the effect. You've got usually some degree of relay neuron in between, and it all starts off with a sensory neuron that's actually depicting it. I have no idea why I did that back to front. I do apologise. And things that we're probably most familiar with, which I was talking through with Z3 last week, well, all 9 of them, pupil reflex. So hopefully you're all aware that when light intensity is quite high, your pupil, or the muscles that actually are in your iris that control the size of your pupil, you get your pupil shutting down, so it narrows, it constricts to reduce the amount of light that gets into your eyes, so that you don't actually completely bleach and knacker your retina. Whereas when you are in low light intensity levels, your pupil dilates, so it opens up, it allows more light in to boost your vision, so on and so forth. The knee reflex, that's fascinating. If you don't know about this, that's to do with proprioception. So your body has an ability to, even if your eyes were closed and you didn't know what was going on, it can read where your body is in space. So, if I close my eyes, I know where my arm is. And it's not just because I deliberately put it there. If somebody came along and I was a mannequin and they positioned my body in a certain way, even with my eyes closed, I should be able to know whether my arm is up or down or flexed or extended. And your body does that by reading the amount of stretch and things like its tendons. So it knows that this muscle is so stretched and this muscle is not as stretched, and it can process that all, put it all together and work out exactly where your limbs, etc. all are. And it's really important. So the knee reflex works because essentially, I'll get my lovely purple knee up. Essentially what happens is you hit this tendon here that's just below your kneecap, your patella. And when you hit it, it bends the tendon in, which actually stretches it slightly. Now, your body knows where your leg is in space, knows what it's told it to do. And then when there is a sudden stretching of that tendon, it assumes that your leg is more bent than it is because the tendon of your knee has bent more. And your body literally goes, well, I never told that knee to bend over there. That's not correct. We need to straighten that again. So then your body automatically tries to straighten your leg to put it back into position. You've fooled it essentially, and that's what causes that brief jerk that should be detectable by a professional. Most of us can't do it on ourselves, to be perfectly frank. You need to completely relax your leg and smack it. But those are some examples of reflexes that we're all familiar with. Final one is the instinctive behaviour. So as I say, that is far more complex than kinesis, taxis and simple reflexes. And this is, although inbuilt, it's sophisticated. There's a lot to it. It involves things like more hormonal responses. You've got other organisms sort of dependent upon it. It's not quite as simple as like one stimulus, one response. You've got like biological rhythms and all sorts of bits and bobs, and we will come into that in more detail. So things you need to know just to start off, it's species specific. So each species will have a different forms of instinctive behaviour, and it's highly stereotyped. So like with the other ones, it should be that every member of that species does the same thing. And this, you can see, is really important when you get into courtship, especially when you do this. Look at all the lovely little bird dances that happen. They are incredibly species specific. It shouldn't be that if you get a particular bird of paradise doing its little funky thing, that shouldn't then attract a duck because they should have completely different courtship behaviours that do not match up. Whereas members of the same species, that should be stereotyped, so they should all be doing the same sort of thing at the same sort of time. And yeah, it works with things like mating, defending territories, courtship rituals, so on and so forth, which they're not always about the survival of an individual. Like, a bird doesn't need to have chicks in order to survive. It doesn't need to reproduce with anything in order to survive, but the species won't survive if its individuals can't successfully reproduce. So it's on a small scale, all this behaviour for individual survival, but it's also on a much bigger scale in terms of the entire species, making sure that they don't become extinct and so on and so forth. I hope that's made sense. There are some slightly rambly little bits in there and some slightly dodgy bits, but do forgive me because I'm just rolling with it at the moment. I'll try and do another one of these for the next section, which is all about learned behaviour. So how we can adapt our responses according to our environment and our context and so on and so forth. If you have any questions, do get in touch, let us know. And I hope you're all managing to stay fit and well during lockdown, which is a crazy time to be existing in. So take care, keep well, see you later.